In 2020, the world changed. The COVID-19 pandemic had enormous social and economic consequences, and it got a lot of people asking questions about personal sovereignty and government responsibility in the face of danger, and how societies should manage the flow of information in an information age. But it also affected us as individuals. Many people lost loved ones, many lost jobs, and even more of us were simply forced to work from home, where we had a lot more time to think, away from the hustle and bustle of the workplace. And it caused a lot of us to ask questions of ourselves. What's really important to me? And what's my purpose in this world? In this episode of World Astrology Report, I'm joined by a special guest, the brilliant astrologer Kira Ryberg. And together, we're going to explore the question of how to use astrology to find purpose in life.
I've talked to a lot of other astrologers about this, and I think there's a huge crisis of purpose right now that's affecting a lot of different people. And as we've moved through this period where a lot of different people had more time on their hands for one reason or another during the pandemic, they started to kind of figure out, what am I interested in? What are my passions? What do I want to spend my free time doing? And I think it led a lot of people just to the point where we're at now, where we're exhausted, we're tired, and most people aren't feeling like they want to contribute to a system that isn't really doing much for them in return.
But before we get to that, we're going to review the mundane astrology that heralded the pandemic. The pandemic, of course, broke out in late 2019 in Wuhan, China, and the first report saying somebody died of a mystery virus appeared in the international media on January the 11th, 2020. And look what was going on in the sky at the time. On January the 12th, we had a conjunction of Saturn and Pluto, joined by the Sun, Mercury and Jupiter, all in the sign of Capricorn. Saturn-Pluto conjunctions come along every 30 to 40 years, and they're consistently associated with the most difficult events in history. The initiation of life and death episodes like the First World War and the Cold War, and even the birth of suicide bombing. And this was a Saturn-Pluto conjunction joined by expansive Jupiter, and in March of 2020 by Mars too. This was rare astrology, the kind that only comes along every few hundred years. Now, the question of how we should have dealt with the pandemic is going to remain a topic of debate forever now. It goes right to the heart of many of the political divisions we see in the world now. But I think something most of us likely would agree upon is that the pandemic caused us to think hard about where we're at in life and what we really want and what we believe.
The pandemic affected people very, very differently, depending on, where you were working at the time, what kind of job you had, all of those different considerations. But I think for a large number of people, especially during the lockdowns, they did have time to kind of figure out what their passions were. And that kind of came through this moment of slowness that we experienced that was unlike anything that I think any of us had ever experienced before. Being, kind of confined to one space, one area, not being able to go out and socialize. It really made people start to question what's important to them and what they value, I think.
So a lot of people found themselves thinking, is this really how I want to spend the rest of my life? Do I really want to use my talents for the benefit of my corporate employer, but when I could be putting them to use for something I really believe in?
One of the common thing that a lot of people are saying these days is, I had this job, I was working for a corporation, the pandemic hit, I either got laid off or I took time off or I was forced to confine. And through that period, I started doing a hobby or I picked up a craft or something like this. And there tends to be a very artistic or creative energy, I think, from a lot of people that are turning more towards, the arts or some type of creative passion or project.
And then there were the people who knew that a change was needed, but they didn't know which direction to go in. Unfortunately, it's this exact situation in which astrology comes into its own. Both Kira and I see clients every day who are searching for more meaning and purpose in their lives. But this prompts the question, how do we use astrology to see something like purpose in the birth chart? And this takes us to the idea of the daimon. If you're interested in learning more about the daimon, I recommend you check out the work of James Hillman, one of the great depth psychologists who explored this idea in his book, The Soul's Code. Of the daimon, Hillman wrote this: "The soul of each of us is given a unique daimon before we are born, and it is selected an image or pattern that we live on Earth. This soul companion, the daimon, guides us here. In the process of arrival, however, we forget all that took place and believe we come empty into this world. The daimon remembers what is in your image and belongs to your pattern, and therefore your daimon is the carrier of your destiny."
James Hillman has this theory called the acorn theory. And it's about how, the acorn is always going to become the oak tree. And so we all have our own little acorn. We're all destined to be something. We all have a purpose or calling or work that we're meant to be doing in this lifetime. And that isn't always what our profession is. Sometimes that's being a mom. Sometimes that's being a friend. Sometimes that's being a researcher or a teacher. There's so many different paths and roles that someone can fulfill and hold in their life that are going to be fulfilling and that are going to be incredibly meaningful, even if it's not what they're doing 9 to 5.
Your whole chart speaks to the theme of calling and purpose, but I personally focus on 2 elements which I think speak best to these themes. One of them is the sun, which symbolizes our spirit, the divine spark that each of us carries. This is the Atman, the one who watches, and how we see the world is going to generate the plot line of our life, because our world is really formed by that to which we pay attention. But the other point in the chart that speaks to these themes, which you may not be aware of, is the lot of spirit, or the lot of daimon. If you're unfamiliar with lots, they were a feature of traditional astrology that were mostly lost to modern astrology. They're also known as Arabic parts because the Arab and Islamic astrologers of the medieval period really developed them and took that idea forward. But essentially, lots are points that are calculated on the chart. We're almost doing some metaphysical mathematics to arrive at them, and they give us more information than what we can see with the planets alone. You can have a lot for any number of things. The lot of the father, the lot of buying and selling, a lot of horsemanship, and the lot of spirit was said to be the lot of the sun. It speaks to solar themes. It's calculated like this. If you're born during the day, you take the distance from the moon to the sun and project it from the ascendant. If you're born during the night, you take the distance from the sun to the moon and project that from the ascendant. Now we're going to look at 2 examples of charts, and we're going to analyze the lot of spirit in each one. And we're going to see how in each case the lot says something important about the life and work of the person concerned. We're also going to refer to the 36 decans of the zodiac here. The decans, or faces, are 10-degree divisions of the zodiac. So there are 3 in each zodiac sign, and they turn each sign into a kind of 3-act story. So we're going to draw heavily on the work of the astrologer and writer Austin Coppock here. Austin literally wrote the book on the decans, The Incredible 36 Faces, which explores the history, meaning, and use of the decans. Now first we're going to look at the chart of Venus Williams, who is a wildly successful tennis player, former world number 1, and winner of 7 Grand Slam titles.
Venus Williams is an international superstar tennis legend, I would say. She's won the Olympics. She's competed in pretty much every single major tennis championship in the world. She held the number 1 ranking for tennis players in the world at one point in her life. She's definitely known for competing with and against her sister Serena, and the kind of dynamic that they have between the 2 of them is something that gets talked a lot about as well, but she's mostly known for her tennis superstardom.
Venus was born on June the 17th, 1980 at 2:12 p.m. in Linwood, California. Here's her chart, and you can see straight away that she has Venus conjunct her sun, the point of the chart that symbolizes her identity, and it's in Gemini, and she's well known for being one of 2 tennis-playing sisters. Astrology, eh? She also has Mercury right at the midheaven of the chart, the part that speaks to career matters. Mercury is a planet traditionally said to signify games and sports. But we're going to focus on the lot of spirit and its ruler here. They're going to show us something profound of the experience Venus's spirit is trying to have in the world.
Venus has her lot of spirit in the 11th house, which is also called the house of good spirit. It's in Leo, which is the sign that is ruled by the sun, and she has her sun in Gemini in the 9th house. And her lot of spirit being in the 11th house is automatically going to say that there's going to be an association with those themes and her spirit and her purpose. And the 11th house is where we find audiences. It's where we find fan bases, community, people with like-minded interests. It's also where we find goals, hopes, and aspirations. And Venus is a very driven person. If you read about her, she's the type of person who's very committed to her goals. And so we kind of see that with her lot of spirit being placed in the 11th house, but we also see her having having clearly a huge fan base of people who are following her career and still are to this day. It's in the sign of Leo, which is the sign that we tend to associate with celebrity, with fame, with recognition. And so we obviously see, those themes coming through really clearly in Venus's lot of spirit. She is very well known. Like we talked about, she has a huge audience. When someone has Leo on the 11th house, it kind of amplifies those themes, since they tend to work together in order to have, a huge audience space. You kind of have to be well known. So we kind of see some connections there as well. And her lot of spirit is in the decan that is ruled by Jupiter. And Austin Coppock calls this decan a crown of laurels. And that is alluding to, the crown that they used to place on victors' heads when they won a competition. And so we see, Venus's entire career, her purpose in life was all about competition and competing in different tennis, competitions throughout her life in all of these different countries. The decans are really cool because they also have tarot associations. And so if you wanted to look at the tarot card that's associated with Venus's decan for her lot of spirit, it would be the Six of Wands. And if you look at what that card is, it's literally someone riding on horseback through a crowd of people with people cheering them on and celebrating them. And that's very much what we see when we have an Olympian, right? It's people just rooting for your victory, cheering you on in a way that most people are probably not going to experience in their lifetime.
But the ruler of the lot is also important. That planet is in charge of bringing about the experience described by the lot itself. And in Venus's case, we find the ruler of the lot, the sun, in the 9th house in the 3rd decan of Gemini.
The 9th house component is really interesting and almost a little bit obvious because it's the house that we tend to associate with travel and international locations. And obviously, as someone who competed in the Olympics and the Australian Open, the French Open, all of these different tennis competitions throughout her lifetime, she was someone who traveled internationally very frequently. But on a very literal level as well, Gemini is the sign of the twins. And we tend to see, a very interesting story unravel when we look at the decan that her sun is placed in, because this is the final decan of Gemini. It is the 10 of Swords card. And a lot of people, if they are familiar with that tarot card, they don't tend to think it's the most positive card in the deck. It tends to be a little bit harsher imagery that comes along with that one. And it's because this is the part of the story of the mythology of the twins where one twin has to kill the other one in order to thrive and to survive. And so oftentimes we see a decision that has to be made in this decan of Gemini, or almost that competitive spirit between siblings or between twins. And that was something that obviously permeated, Venus's life, was that competition and rivalry that she had with her sister Serena.
And there are also astrological techniques to see exactly when in life we'll start to live our purpose.
The one that I tend to rely on most predominantly is zodiacal releasing. And with that technique, you can actually identify exact periods when people are going to encounter their purpose. And for Venus, she had this when she was 14. And if you look up what Venus was doing around the age of 14, well, it was the first time she ever played tennis professionally in her life. And so we see that encounter with purpose in a very real way. It's really amazing that we have access to this technique that will tell you when someone's going to encounter their purpose. And it's proven to be very valuable for clients as well.
This can be really powerful as confirmation that you're on the right path. And it can give you clues about the periods of your life you need to think about if you're struggling to figure out what your purpose really is. If you're enjoying this episode, please do me a favor and hit that like button. And if you haven't already, why not subscribe and make sure you don't miss future episodes. Now we're going to look at a very different example. This time we're going to look at the chart of the artist Vincent van Gogh. Van Gogh is one of the world's most famous painters, the artist behind many paintings you'll have seen, including these self-portraits, sunflowers, and this one, the astrologer's favorite, Starry Night. And in Van Gogh's life, we see a vivid expression of the tortured artist archetype. Here's his chart. We find a lot of spirit in the sign of Scorpio in the 5th house of creativity.
Oftentimes when people have major 5th house placements, they tend to be artists of some kind, or someone who's creating something that they then put out into this world, whether that's a child or a piece of art or something of that nature. It's where we go for leisure time. It's where we go to kind of interact with our hobbies and engage with different things that make us relax or enjoy life a little bit more. And so for Van Gogh, when we see that he has this lot of spirit in the 5th house, it's really perfect because he was obviously an artist who went on to create, a huge body of work. And it's in the sign of Scorpio. And so we know that those are going to be very emotionally charged kind of creations, that they're going to bring him into the depths of his emotional experiences. And that's probably where that art is going to stem from. And I think we really see that in a lot of Van Gogh's paintings. He does self-portraits, he does things of his local environment and his local area, and just where he's, spending a lot of time. And it feels like there is a component there of his true self or his emotional state that he's communicating through his artwork. And so there's something really beautiful about that there. And it's also in the second decan of Scorpio. And so, one of the definitions of this decan is that it says it's a face of affronts, stirring up mischiefs and quarrels between men, and continuing the strife that it stirreth up. And so there is something here about this part of Scorpio being a little bit contentious and a little bit problematic in some ways. And we know that Van Gogh did not lead a very, easy life. He had a lot of different struggles, and he actually did have contentions with other men. When he cut off his ear, it was when he was in a fight with another man. But his lot of spirit is also in the bounds of Venus. And the bounds, or the terms, are unequal subsections of the zodiac signs that give us a little bit more information about what tools a planet or a lot has at its disposal. And so his lot of spirit is in Venus's bounds, which we might think means the tools that Van Gogh has at his disposal that his spirit is using are paintbrushes, right? Are the tools of Venus, the things that we use to create art and beauty in this world. The ruler of the sign is Mars, and the ruler of the bound is Venus, and both of them are conjunct in Pisces in Van Gogh's ninth house. And Venus is exalted in Pisces, and Mars is also very powerful there. So we kind of have this power couple hanging out in the ninth house of Van Gogh's chart. And I think that there is a really beautiful quality of, emotional depth here that we see with this conjunction. But the fact that it's placed in the ninth house is also really notable and interesting, because the ninth house in Hellenistic astrology was called the house of God. And a lot of people might not know, but Van Gogh was a very religious man. He grew up in a very religious household. I believe his father was a minister as well. And so he actually didn't get invested in art until a little bit later in his life, because so much of what he was focused on before was religion. He wanted to go and be a theologian. He went to try to get a degree, and I think he didn't pass his theology exam. Mars in the ninth house things in a day chart, having a little bit more trouble with educational matters.
The example of Van Gogh shows vividly how sometimes what we're trying to experience in the world isn't easy. Sometimes our purpose can involve being tested and challenged, and sometimes even disappointed. Not everyone plays the game of life on easy mode. Both Kira and I are available for natal consultations, where we use the techniques described here and others to help people find calling and purpose in their lives. Details are in the description below.
Yeah, if you're interested in this kind of stuff or anything that we talked about today, I'm open for consultations, and you can book a reading with me at my website, which is www.kiraryberg.com. And if you are looking to learn more about astrology and maybe want to learn how zodiacal releasing works, I also have a lecture on that on my website that will kind of teach you how to use this technique. And so if you really want to get into the foundations of it, you too can learn from me. So check that out if you're interested. And that's me.
Before we go, I want to thank Kira for joining me in this episode. If you're enjoying this episode and you're curious about the astrology that brought about the pandemic, then I recommend you watch this episode. I made it with the astrologer S.J. Anderson, and in it, we look at the astrology of the pandemic and show how one astrologer, Andre Barbeau, was able to predict it years in advance. That's it for this episode. See you next time.